Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 16. um, I'm going to start off by saying Happy Father's Day, everyone, especially you, Papa Baboon. Um, it feels right to kind of share one of my favorite moments from your role as my father. So here we go.
Well, thank you, Offspring.
All right, we're going to jump right into today's content. So we're going to start with a question from Joseph from San Francisco, who asks, are male and female brains different?
I could answer half of the questions here with the exact same first sentence, which is, oh, it's totally clear. Yes and no. There's no difference between female and male brains by sex, and I'm using sex here in the biological sense since we're talking about rats as often as we're talking about people. They're the same. They're made of atoms, they're made of molecules, they're made of neurons. It's the same exact neurotransmitters. It's the same action potentials, it's the same parts of the brain. So, no difference at all until you look closely, if you happen to want to look closely. And if you do, people started spotting some sex differences, first centered around the hypothalamus. One area that tends to specialize in female sexual behavior, the ventromedial hypothalamus. One area for males, medial preoptic area, and they have different sizes and different sort of structure underneath the microscope there and such. So people found that, and I was totally amazing and the best thing ever and earth-shattering. There's a female and there's a male brain. And they went and looked, and like all over the brain, there's sex differences. Two of them strike me as fairly interesting, though. One of them is in the hypothalamus, where the female hypothalamus has to do something much fancier than the male hypothalamus, which is to have cyclic hormone release. If you are a female hamster, every 4 days it goes up and goes down. The hormones, the gonadotropic hormones that you release from your hypothalamus, they're doing that. And if you're a male, it's just incoherently going about that. This is a fancier wiring project during development. The other is this part of the brain called the corpus callosum. We got two hemispheres in the brain, cortex on each side, neurons on one side of the want to talk to neurons on the other side occasionally. And what they do, keeping the dog away from the salad, what they do is, sorry, come back. What they do is they send axons from one side way over to the other side, and there's a bridge. There is a bridge of axons between the two hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And what you see is there's a sex difference. On the average, female corpus callosi are bigger, thicker, and or more densely packed with axons, showing more integrated communication between the two hemispheres there, which is a standard trope in terms of a sex difference in cortical function. Male neurons are much more likely to have projections that are local little pockets of expertise. Females are more long distance integrative. So that's particularly coming through with that corpus callosum. Okay, so all that being said, that's totally amazing and fantastic. Could you look at somebody's brain and tell what sex they are by looking at it, looking under the bestest microscope in the world? Absolutely not. These are populational differences. These are statistical differences. These are distributions with huge amounts of overlap. The similarities mathematically are much more striking than the differences. Nonetheless, they are there. They've got something to do with some interesting stuff like sexual orientation and sexual identities. So yes, we have a sexually dimorphic brain, not very much, and nothing that tells us much about individuals.
There's also sort of a callback here to our 80-20 principle conversation a few episodes back with Simon Baron Cohen's research with sort of autism spectrum disorder tending to bear closer resemblance to the male structure with regard to the corpus callosum density or thickness, right?
Yes, his notion of the hypermale brain and isolated islands of function and expertise, but less integrated. Great, thank you.
All right, next, Kevin from Finland asks, did you and your wife subject your offspring to the marshmallow test or any other cool tests when they were younger?
We couldn't do the marshmallow test on you and your brother. It was just too logistically difficult because you don't remember this, but we initially raised both of you in hydroponic gardens, and then we switched you to Skinner boxes, so you weren't very accessible.
Okay, Matteo from Italy says, I read recently about something called Jerusalem syndrome where tourists become psychotic. Is this an actual psychiatric disorder?
Oh, Matteo, that's the best. That's one of my favorite bizarre psychiatric maladies. It is not officially in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but there have been papers published on it in psychiatry journals. Jerusalem syndrome. Jerusalem syndrome is where people go to Jerusalem and have a psychotic break. Let's expand that a little bit. It's a typical subset of people, which is American, older Southern Baptist tourists who go to the Holy Land to see it. And these are people where, they've been looking forward their entire lives to finally go to the Holy Land, and they get there, and there's some predictors. These tend to be individuals, not depression or anxiety, individuals who are traveling alone and are having a lot of jet lag problems. So they're lying in bed at night. And what they are always struck with in this is this profound disappointment. They are coming to see like the streets where Christ walked, and there's like traffic jams and litter and jerky people and pickpockets and police, and it's a modern city. They are deeply, deeply disappointed by this, and thus lying there at night, unmoored by anybody else telling them to calm down. They have a psychotic break. And here's the best detail: a huge percentage of the time, before you know it, they've pulled apart the sheets of their hotel bed, taken off their clothes, made a toga out of the sheets, and they are soon on the streets of Jerusalem preaching about how people need to go back to simpler ways. It's the best. Okay, some modifiers there. About half the cases there are histories of psychosis, but in about half, none whatsoever. What you see is these are people who you ship them back home and their head clears and is perfectly fine. And what the papers published on this show is there's like 50 cases a year at the psychiatric hospital there. One person a week has this happening to them. So that is totally extraordinary. It actually strikes me the way to prevent Jerusalem syndrome is have the sheets in the hotel be something like paisley, because like who wants to make a paisley toga? That would stop it right at the starts there. There is an interesting new cousin of Jerusalem syndrome that I saw recently, which is Mecca syndrome. And it's the exact same thing. People do their required once in a lifetime Hajj to Mecca there, and there's like car fumes and there's litter and it's the exact same psychotic break. Okay, it gets better. Then there's what is known as Paris syndrome. And for reasons I don't understand, but culturally, virtually all the cases of it, and there's about a dozen cases a year, are Japanese tourists. I don't know what the cultural view is of Paris and French culture in Japan, but apparently it's this permeating sense of Paris as the promised land, Paris where everybody is skinny and fashionable and gliding down the streets and all of that. And I don't know why that defines Paris, but they get there and it's once again traffic jams and Parisians who are like mean and snooty, and they have a psychotic break with the disappointment. Same exact thing. They do not go and start preaching. They merely have a psychotic break, about a dozen cases a year, and they sort of cool their heels for a while with somebody checking over their shoulder, and it all clears, and they send it back home, and never again. Okay, Matteo, in honor of that, there's one additional one of these, Matteo of Italy, Stendhal syndrome, which I can understand. Stendhal, the French writer, the first time he went to Florence, he got this giddied dizziness at all of the amazing artwork there and felt like he needed to scream or fling himself into one of the statues. So that's Stendhal syndrome. But there you have them: Jerusalem syndrome, Mecca syndrome, Paris syndrome, and Stendhal syndrome.
Finally, Queven from Ireland says, I've heard you say you sometimes teach juries about the brain in court cases. How did you get into that? What is that like as an experience? How many cases have you done, etc.?
Oh, this was about 20 years ago where I got a phone call. I guess people used phones then, from this guy, a public defender, who, I don't know why he got it in his head that I would be of some help with a defense case, a murder trial, which I signed on for and flew down and got all sorts of information about it. And this was, if I was, I don't know, in 1940s and I was in overalls, I would say this was a humdinger of a case. This was a nightmare of a case. This was a serial killer who already had like half a dozen life sentences without parole in some other state and had been shipped over to this other state to stand trial for two more murders of like these adolescent boys, and unbelievably horrible stuff that he had done to people over that time. And just not so. He pleaded guilty. There was no question that he was guilty. And this was the penalty phase, with the jury deciding, do they give him another lifelong without possibility of parole, or do they give him the death sentence? And what was interesting in the case of this guy was, when he was still a child, he was in a car accident that caused substantial damage to his frontal cortex. And I think it is fair to say that he was a broken machine thereafter. And when you look at the details of some of the things that he did, you see this was massively abnormal behavior. So what I was there for was to tell the jury about, what this part of the brain, frontal cortex, does to regulating your behavior, doing appropriate behaviors, and all of that. And like, big preparation. It was so cool. It was so cool with a lawyer, because he did things like tell me who was on the jury. So this person is going to frown at you the whole time, but don't worry about them because they're just a crab. But speak to that person back there. They're looking sympathetic. And it was just like so dramatic and exciting. And I get in there and it suddenly stopped being dramatic and exciting. And what I saw instead was this terrifying looking broken machine guy who was manacled. And over in the corner was the glove and baseball bat that the boys had when they were abducted, that were found at the scene. And sitting there in front, following every word, were their mothers. And oh my God, the damage that can be wrought upon humans. So we achieved what we were aiming for with the first jury, which was one person who held out against the death penalty. So we got a hung jury. And about 3 months later, we got to do it all over again. And the jury came back in after a few hours and gave him the death penalty. And he's been on death row ever since. Okay, so I thought, like, that is my introduction to this kind of thing. Oh, these florid, amazing nightmare cases. And in the dozen or so cases I've done since then, they're totally different. And they're all basically the exact same case. You get some guy who, by the time he was a third trimester fetus, he was already like the die was cast. Fetal alcohol syndrome, substance abuse by the mother during pregnancy, abandonment, strings of foster homes, sexual abuse, physical abuse, all of that, along the way, living on the streets by the time they're 15, already an alcoholic, already like addicted to something or other, half a dozen concussive head injuries along the way, and half a dozen times that somebody sort of stabbed them or tried to stab them or whatever. And they're now living on the streets. They're about 25 and interacting with someone else with the exact same horrible, awful history, and some tension comes up. And our guy had been jumped 3 months ago by somebody with a knife who stabbed him, and he spent some time in the hospital with that, so he's attuned to this. And this other guy is aggressive and threatening him and all of that, and pulls out a knife. And oh, this is all over again. Here we are in the exact same scenario, and our guy pulls out a knife and very adeptly stabs the guy in the torso. And the guy goes down and he is out. I don't know if he is dead yet, but this was like a grievous, he is no longer a threat. He is no longer a threat to anyone sort of observing this objectively. And our guy begins to walk away. And it seems like on every one of these murders, there's always a closed circuit TV. So you can actually time it. He walks away, and 8 seconds later, he changes his mind and comes back and stabs the guy like 72 more times. And thus we have, if he had just stabbed him once, it would have been self-defense. And now instead we have first-degree premeditated murder because this guy had 8 seconds to premeditate. And what I would then do is like take the jury and go through, okay, so this is what's going on in your brain when you make a decision. This is what's going on in your brain when you're making a decision while you are stressed out of your mind and all sorts of stuff is not working very well, and you become impulsive and you're working on reflexive stuff and judgment goes out the window. Here's what your brain looks like if you were pickled in alcohol as a fetus, beaten again and again, concussive head trauma, et cetera, all of that. Here's every pathway which is going to fail to work at that juncture where that guy had to choose between it's over with, walk away, or maybe I'll just be on the safe side and stab him another 70 times or so. And it's always the same punchline. If you and the jury had had the same exact history, you would have been unable to control your behavior to the exact same extent. And this is someone whose brain was broken by the unbelievable bad luck tossed at him over and over again. And it's great because like some of them nod, and if you're really lucky, like somebody on the jury is an engineer, so they can think mechanistically about things, and that's terrific and all of that. And all you need to do is get one person who's a holdout, because it has to be unanimous jury decisions. I think we just saw a few weeks ago a unanimous jury decision in New York City where many people were hoping for one lone holdout who thought America could be great again, but unanimous. So it would have to, so you're aiming for, can you get one person nodding? Yeah, maybe the engineer will be able to think in terms of this is a broken machine. This is not an evil soul. And they go into the jury room and they look at the pictures of the corpse, and then they come back with, first degree murder. And I've done a dozen of these now, and we've lost 11 out of 12 of those. I think I'm probably not doing any more now because I had this book come out last year where I say there's no free will whatsoever. The criminal justice system makes no sense. It is intellectually and ethically bankrupt and has to be completely trashed. And usually the prosecuting attorney at that point sort of pulls the judge aside and says, this guy's slated to come on next. This is what he thinks. So they knock me out at that point. So I think I've done my last trial. One of the things I've been most impressed with are public defenders. These are people, everybody goes into law school and they're going to defend the poor, they're going to work on a Native American reservation, and 5 years later, they're in some corporate firm, and these are the ones who actually go and do it. And they work incredibly hard with like no resources and lousy salaries compared to what they can get in the corporate world. And they lose 95% of the time because they are given cases like these. And they come back again and again and again, hoping every now and then that somebody's horrible luck can finally be appreciated by a jury. They are the best. I am so impressed with those folks. So that is my courtroom experience. My guess is it's over with, but it has been first interesting for what an amazing, unbelievably florid case it was, and then this long string of just dim, depressing ways in which people's lives, victim, perpetrator, everybody in between, has just gone off the rails from way back when.
Yeah, you really can't get a much clearer example of the real world importance of understanding this no free will stuff.
Yep, it's a hard sell.
And on that note, that is all for episode 16. As always, keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.